Hi, my name is Patricia Marcy, and I'm the Executive Director of the Vanguard Research Group. And today I'm going to present Practical Introduction to Research in the Community Health Clinic. And this is Research 101, which is part of our webinar series that we're presenting on clinical research. So Vanguard Research Group is a research organization that specializes in conducting research at community health clinics across the United States. Our mission is to connect real-world treatment centers with the opportunity to participate in research trials, and we select trials that are in line with the treatment needs of the community health clinics with which we partner. Our other goal is to partner with community health clinics outside of clinical trials, and we do this by assisting clinics with their own quality improvement projects, or perhaps helping them obtain grant funding to conduct some of their own internal research projects, as well as we provide continuing education. In this training, I will go through what is research. I'll provide you an introduction to the Institutional Review Board. We'll talk about the clinical trial life cycle, and then we'll go into several of the components of research, which include good clinical practice, regulatory binder, study documentation, confidentiality, and safety reporting. So what is clinical research? Clinical research is the systematic way to determine the answer to a question or a hypothesis. And this could look like, does medication A work better than medication B? Is this new therapy that we've designed better at improving the quality of life than the existing therapy that we're already providing? It could look at taking a medication in a different way. So is someone who takes a long-acting injectable form of medication, will they do better clinically than somebody who takes the same oral medication? So in order to answer questions like that, we need to collect data in a systematic and organized fashion and analyze it. And this is defined in what we call a clinical protocol. So why is clinical research important? Clinical research is essential to the development of new treatments for medical conditions because research studies systematically and scientifically determine if a new treatment is effective for a specific condition or symptom. So they look at data in a systematic way that allows them to determine, does this treatment or therapy work better than existing treatments or therapies? Research has been the main factor that has contributed to improvements in the standards of medical care. And some of examples of that are psychiatrists might still be performing lobotomies if research studies hadn't proved in the mid-20th century that they were not effective. Patients with HIV had a very short life expectancy in the 1980s, but in the last 40 years, several medications have been developed, and now those patients can live long and healthy lives. As well as you'll see recently with COVID-19, there have been numerous medications and vaccines that have been developed based on research. So what is the difference between standard medical care and medical care you receive in a medical study? Within standard medical care, the medical professionals that are providing treatment, their main goal is the benefit of the patient. And they are following treatment guidelines that have already been developed. This could be medication guidelines that are developed by the FDA. It could be following an evidence-based practice modules. So there are treatment guidelines that have already been developed that they're following. And these new treatments or for medical conditions are a direct result from information that was obtained from patient volunteers. So in standard medical care, the treatments that are provided have already been evaluated in clinical research trials. In medical study, we're intending to learn about new potential treatments. So these treatments have not yet been validated as effective. In a medical study, the treatment provider has to follow a very specific clinical protocol, which indicates exactly what treatment a participant may or may not receive and how it is to be provided. The goal of this medical study is to gather information to determine if the treatment that's under study is actually effective or not. And patients who participate in the study may not directly benefit from being in the study. At this point, we do not know if the treatment is more effective than standard medical care, but information that is collected in this study will help future participants. So who would perform the research in your clinic? At each clinic, they would have to develop what we call a local research team. And this normally consists of a principal investigator. And this is the person that is overall responsible for the conduct of the research at your site. And the requirements of the research program will actually determine who should fulfill the role of the PI. But typically this could be a doctor, a PhD or PharmD, perhaps a PA, a nurse practitioner, or a master's level clinician. It depends on the trial. A medication trial normally needs to have some sort of MD or nurse practitioner or PA, somebody who can prescribe medications. A therapy trial may be just a master's level clinician or perhaps a PhD. Every site also needs to have what we call a research coordinator. And this is the person who's responsible for really the day-to-day conduct of the study. So they have overall coordination, scheduling patient assessments and visits. They recruit the patients into the study, and they're responsible for the overall data collection. And then any other roles that are needed at your site will be dependent on the type of study you're doing, but could include therapists, physical therapists, case managers, nurses, other types of clinical providers. So for example, if you're doing a study that involves MRI, you might have an imaging tech who needs to be part of the study. The next few slides, I'm really going to go through the life cycle of a study, and we'll start with study initiation. So there are initial study documents that you will be provided for each study. And these study documents are usually developed by the study sponsor, or if this is a study that's being done by an investigator at your site, they will create the documents. The first is the clinical protocol. So this is the information on why we're doing the study. It contains the hypothesis. It provides what treatments will be provided and how they will be provided, what data will be collected and when it will be collected, as well as it will summarize what are the planned data analysis that will be conducted to determine if the treatment is effective or not. Then we have the informed consent form, that are referred to as the ICF. And this is a consent form that is provided to and signed by the participant. And it describes the study, why we're doing the study. It lists all the required procedures and expectations for the participant. And then it also goes into any potential risks that they may have to be aware of, as well as any potential benefits. The third set of documents is what we call participant information or instruction. So anything that is provided to the participant in the study needs to also be created prior to study start. And this could be things such as treatment handouts or flyers, informational brochures. Next, I'll talk about the Institutional Review Board, or what we call the IRB. So all research that is conducted with human subjects must be reviewed and approved by an independent committee. And this would be the IRB. So IRBs are independent committees that were developed to formally review clinical research studies. Most large academic institutions have their own independent institutional review board committee, which will review all protocols done there. However, there are also multiple commercial IRBs, which we refer to as central IRBs. And this was for community clinics that do not have an affiliation with an academic institution. They would send their documents to a central IRB for approval. IRBs review the research protocols, the related materials that we already discussed, such as informed consent or investigational brochures, patient handouts. And they review these to ensure the protection of the rights and welfare of human subjects of research. So they look at all of this material to make sure it's ethical, that it meets the standard of care, that it is going to be done. It will not provide undue risk to the participants. So before a research study can begin, it needs to be reviewed and approved by the IRB. So this is what we call the initial IRB submission. At this point, the study investigator or the local clinical site or sponsor, depending on the study, will submit the protocol, the informed consent, and any other research-related documents to the IRB for review and approval. At this point, the IRB will review the documents and they will then either approve the study, so you're ready to go, or they may deny approval or provide what we call a contingent approval after review. If the IRB denies the approval, the investigator can address any concerns that they brought up and perhaps resubmit for approval. There may be something that was missing or something they want added to the protocol. The IRB could provide what they call contingent approval, and this is where the study is technically approved after the investigator addresses a couple of comments, and they'll need to resubmit those. So typically this may be if they want a couple of things added to the informed consent, they would give you contingent approval. So you are approved once you give them the consent form with the modifications. And then once the IRB has actually provided complete full approval, then they will provide you this in a written approval letter, as well as they will certify your ICF. So they usually put some sort of stamp on the bottom of the ICF to say that it's been approved. And throughout the study, you'll find that there are different types of submissions to the IRB. So the initial IRB submission, this is what we just talked about to get your initial approval. During the course of the study, if you make any changes to the protocol, this would be a modification, and it must be approved by the IRB prior to adapting the change, unless there's some sort of safety risk, and then you can adapt the change immediately. But if perhaps, let's say you want to add in a new clinical assessment measure, you would need to modify the protocol, indicate that change in the ICF, and submit all of those to the IRB for approval prior to starting those changes. Every year, IRBs are required to review the study information. So this is the continuing review or annual check-in. IRB approvals are granted for 1 year at a time. And so every year you submit an update to the IRB. During the course of the study, if something does not happen according to the protocol, so you miss collecting a data point or you miss a whole entire visit, that would be what we call a protocol deviation. And protocol deviations need to be collected and submitted to the IRB per their instructions. And then later I will talk to you about unanticipated problems and serious adverse events. But this is a safety event that may happen during the study, and if it does need to be submitted to the IRB. And then finally, once the study ends or is terminated, a study closeout report needs to be submitted to the IRB. And this will occur after all the participants have finished the study and all your data has been collected. Next, I'm going to talk about regulatory documents. And this is a group of documents that you need in order to conduct the study. And again, we refer to this group of documents as regulatory documents. The documents that you need will be dependent upon the type of study you're doing. So for some studies, you might need more documents if you're doing like a medication study versus a therapeutic or maybe a new technology study. For every study, you will need a copy of your CV or resume for all the staff that are working on the study. So this would be the principal investigator, research coordinator, and any other local site staff. If that staff has a medical license, like a MD, you would need that. And then you will keep a copy of all training documentation that you have. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but good clinical practice, any protocol training, if there's specific training on an assessment in the study, this will all be kept in your regulatory documents. For some studies, you'll need to report any conflict of interest or financial disclosure. And this is a document that indicates if you have any conflict of interest with the study sponsor. If you're doing a study with a new medication that's trying to be developed, they most likely have an IND, which is an investigational new drug number, and that's done by the FDA. And that will need to be submitted on what we call a 1572. And this is where the investigator signs off that they are responsible for the conduct of the study at their site. And then any other sponsor required documents. So there are several other documents that will likely be required depending on the study that you're doing. For every study, you need some sort of equipment normally and training. The protocol and or sponsor will provide you with a list of equipment that you might need and the training that's required for the study. So you may need vital signs equipment, so something to take a person's blood pressure. You may need training on how to conduct that blood pressure, or training on an MRI or another type of data assessment that you're completing. So prior to starting the study, all the equipment that you will need for the study must be obtained, and any required calibration or training is completed. So if you're doing a study where you're using an MRI machine, they may require you to do a test MRI to make sure that the machine is calibrated, and they would document that you've completed that training. And all training and calibration documentation will be included in any regulatory documents. In order to be activated for a study, to recruit participants, the site has to receive IRB approval. You need to complete any required training. You also need to obtain the necessary equipment and make sure that you have done your calibration. And then you have to have completed and submitted all required regulatory documents. Next, we'll go into study conduct. So this gives you a picture of the study life cycle, where you'll start with enrollment. So you recruit participants into the study. Then you will conduct the required study visits as listed in the protocol. Then you'll move into follow-up, which is a follow-up visit after the protocol's ended for each participant. And then we will close out the study at each site, and then we do the data analysis and get to the results. So when starting with enrollment, the first portion of enrollment is recruitment. And this is where either the investigator or the study coordinator or whoever is determined at your site as a designee will identify potential participants. So they may look through your medical records and say, oh, this person looks like they'd be a good participant for the study. And then once you've identified potential participants, somebody at your center needs to make contact with that participant to see if they're interested. And if they are interested in learning more, that is where they would be scheduled to review the informed consent. And they can either come in or do this over telemedicine for what we call the informed consent visit. And this may take multiple visits, but this is where the study team will then describe the study to the potential participant, determine if it's a good fit, and then if the participant agrees that it's a good fit, they're interested still after reviewing the informed consent, then they would sign this consent document, which then says they agree to participate in the study. After the informed consent document is signed, that's when we begin what we call the screening procedures. And no screening procedures can begin until after an informed consent document is signed. So once you've signed the informed consent, the coordinator or designee would schedule the participant for what we call a screening visit. And this is where we collect initial data. And again, this is detailed in the protocol, what we're collecting and how we're collecting it. And we do this to determine if the participant meets inclusion and exclusion criteria. So this, again, is listed in the protocol. It lists everything the participant must meet and everything they must not meet in order to join the study. If after doing the screening visit, the results show that the participant is eligible to participate in the study, then they will be what we call enrolled into the study. So this is where they will begin the study visits. If this study involves randomization, at this point, then they would be randomized into one of the different treatment arms. So after you've enrolled the participant into the study, that is when they will start completing all the required study visits and procedures as detailed in the protocol. And the protocol will provide information on when these visits are to occur. So they may have to come in once a week or once a month, and it will tell you which procedures you need to do at each visit. And this is normally found in the protocol under what we call the schedule of assessments. So this is a table that usually details when the visits are to occur and what assessment is completed at each visit. All the data that is collected at each visit is then entered into a study database by the site coordinator. So they will have various forms on which they collect the data, and then they usually enter it into an electronic database. Also, during the conduct of all these visits, the study team will always collect side effect or adverse event data from the participant throughout the entire treatment period. And this is really important. We'll talk about safety later, but this is something that is collected throughout the study. Then after all the study visits are completed, the participant will complete one final visit, and this is called the follow-up visit. This is normally about 4 weeks after their last study visit, so 4 weeks after their treatment has ended. And the purpose of this visit is to assess participant safety. So they want to ensure that if they had any side effects or adverse events that started during the study, that those have resolved. And we want to confirm that no new side effects or adverse events have started. Then we move to closeout, and this is where we close out all research activities at the local community clinic. And this is where it happens only after all the participants at your site have completed their follow-up visit. And during the closeout visit, at this point, this is where the sponsor will review study files for completeness and make sure that there's no missing data or documents. They will have the site finalize the last data entry points. If they have any questions or what we call queries, they will make sure that all of those are resolved. If you have any supplies, those may need to be returned at that point. And then if it was a study involving drug, this would also either be destroyed or returned at this point. And then lastly, once all of this has happened, the study site will submit a notice to the IRB that your study is now closed. Then after all the sites are closed and all the data is collected, we move on to data analysis. And this is the process of statistically evaluating the data that's obtained in the study. It's conducted by a statistician, and it assesses the validity of the hypothesis. Sometimes in the middle of the study, we can do what we call an interim data analysis. And this is where maybe they look at one data point or two data points during the study to make sure everything is being conducted according to the protocol. And then after the data analysis is complete, we move on to the results. So once the data has been analyzed, it can then be determined if the study achieved their hypothesis. And then results from the study can lead to many different things. So this could be where we want to study the intervention further. So we might have seen something positive. Maybe we partially met the hypothesis, so we need further studies or larger studies to confirm. If this is a large, like what we call phase 3 trial, it could lead to FDA approval of a new medication. Most studies do try to publish their results, so the results of the study may be published in a scientific journal. And if the study did achieve their hypothesis, and it could potentially result in implementation of treatment in standard care practices. So it could change how we provide treatment. So for the next few slides, I'm going to go into various components of conducting research, and I'll start with good clinical practice. So good clinical practice is an international ethical and scientific quality standard for design, conduct, performance, monitoring, auditing, recording, analysis, and reporting human subject research. So this basically means that this is sort of the standards we must follow when conducting clinical research, so we are ethical and scientific in how we conduct the research. So we provide ethical standards that are there to protect the right, safety, and well-being and confidentiality of trial subjects. And then quality, it provides quality standards so that it ensures that the data that we collect is credible and accurate. And the PI, again, the principal investigator, is ultimately responsible for the activities of the trial at their center. So if the research coordinator is collecting data, they should have oversight to make sure it's being done ethically and with good quality. We next talk about good documentation practices. So these are the standards in which we accurately and complete study documents that are created and maintained in the study. So we want to make sure that any documents that we are collecting during the study are accurate and complete. This could include source documents and case report forms, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. It ensures the integrity of the data at the end of the day. And the documentation should follow the course of the participant in the study from consent process through all their study visits through their follow-up visit. So some principles of good documentation practice are that documenting all study procedures as they occur and not retrospectively. Backdating is not allowed. So the data needs to be collected as the study is being conducted and not retrospectively. All notes that are written by hand need to be in blue or blank ink on paper, or they should be documented in an approved electronic medical record that is dated. If you have changes or corrections to data that has been collected, especially if it's on paper. It needs to be crossed out. It should not be erased or use whiteout. Then that crossout needs to be dated and initialed by the person making the change. And occasionally you may need to do a progress note, or what we call a note to file, to document the explanation for the change in the data. Study documentation should follow ALCOA principles, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And one of the rules for us that we always tell sites to follow is if something is not documented, it did not happen. So we encourage everything to be documented. So ALCOA stands for attributable. So this is, we should know who clearly created the document. So if we see a progress note, it should have the investigator's name or the research coordinator's name. Whoever created that document should be listed on that progress note. Legible, that means it should be easily read. So if this progress note is written on paper, we should be able to read the writing of the person who wrote it. Contemporaneous, it should again be done in real time. No retrospective data entry. Original, meaning it should be the original document, not a photocopy, because those can be manipulated or changed. And it should be accurate. So the data that is being documented, it needs to be accurate and correct. It should be checked for errors and inconsistencies, especially with electronic medical records. You can see that some things get automatically carried over, like medications that they're no longer on, and that needs to be corrected. And finally, it should be complete. So it should provide a complete picture of the participant's life in the trial. Next, I'm going to talk about the regulatory binder. So a regulatory binder refers to all the regulatory documents that we've already spoken about, and we can call those essential documents that are related to the conduct of the research at your study. And essential documents are those documents that individually and collectively permit evaluation of the conduct of the trial and the quality of the data produced. So these documents demonstrate the compliance of the investigator, sponsor, and monitor with the standards of good clinical practice and all applicable regulatory requirements. And regulatory binders can be physical binders, or they can be kept electronically. So what are the essential documents that you might follow in a regulatory binder? Many of these I've already spoke about, but you will have administrative documents. So this would be the CVs that I already talked to you about, any sort of contracts or agreements, study termination, IRB documents. Then we have team-related documents. So these documents will be related to the team at your site. So this could include a team contact list. If you've been monitored, audited, that log. There's a delegation of responsibilities log that lists what everybody at your site is doing on the trial. And then there are participant-related documents. So here, this would be documents that list information related to the participants in the study. And this could include a screening log, consent forms, any other type of advertisement or recruitment materials that are used for the participant. Again, with documentation, we're going to go into what is source documentation and what are case report forms. So source documents are the original documents, data, or records that are created during a clinical study. And source documents are required by regulatory and GCP guidelines. These, again, can be paper or electronic documents. And the information on the source documents is what is used to populate the study case report forms, which capture the study data, and that again can be electronic or paper. And examples of source documents are the informed consent. These would be the EMR progress notes, the laboratory reports, pharmacy records, imaging reports. So anything where it first documents the participants' information about the participant in the study is called a source document. So source documents is where the information is first recorded. It's the original document, like the EMR progress note. And the data here supports the participant eligibility, so indicates if they're eligible or not, and any protocol required data. It validates all the data that's on the case report forms in the database. It should be maintained in a participant research binder, and it should not ever be altered. Case report forms are used to submit data for analysis. So all the data that you collect in the source documents is then entered into usually an electronic database on what we call an eCRF or an electronic CRF. And this captures the procedures required for each visit per protocol. And it ensures that data is collected in a standardized way. So for example, they may have a medication form. So then everyone who's in the study is capturing medication in the same way, with perhaps start date, end date, name of medication, type of medication. And the case report forms need to be signed and initialed and dated by the person completing the CRF. And that can be done electronically if you're using an electronic database. And occasionally, some CRFs may also be source documents. So for example, if you ask a patient to complete a daily diary of maybe when they're taking their medication, that source document is actually study data and will not need to be transcribed. So examples of source documents versus CRFs. So a copy of signed consent forms and then perhaps an enrollment note in the EMR, that would be a source doc. And then visit assessment, so any test results like laboratory results, so that would be a source document. If you have prescribed a drug or there's order forms, medication diaries, again, and perhaps study participant, they might have some questionnaires they complete, that would be done on a source document. Case report forms, for example, would be a demographic form. So this may capture the participant's gender and age, and that would be taken from information that's actually on a source document in their EMR. Any progress notes that are in the EMR, they may be transcribed onto a CRF. And again, any progress notes may indicate information about a side effect. Again, that would be put onto what we call an adverse event record. Next, I'll talk about confidentiality in clinical research. So there are 3 types of confidentiality for study data. One is identifiable. So this is data that could identify the person from an individual participant record. So this would be something that had maybe their name or their birth date on it. De-identified data is data that all subject identifiers have been removed. And this data can be used freely in the study, and the fact that it does not have any information about them. Normally, when a participant enrolls into the study, they get assigned what's called a participant ID, and this would be a number that is associated with them. However, that number is used in all study data collected, so nobody knows who that ID belongs to. It does not contain their name or birth date or any identifiable information. And then we have what we call a limited data set. This is data that is only available to researchers, which provides access to data elements such as date of a procedure or maybe geographic location. And it's necessary for data analysis, but it is not identifiable. The informed consent will describe to the participant all the data that's being collected in the study, how it will be analyzed, and who will have access to the data. So information contained in medical records, diaries, or elsewhere will be protected, and it will be not disclosed without the permission of the participant. So when they sign the informed consent, it will detail information about confidentiality, and they will agree to the confidentiality terms for that study by signing the informed consent. So study staff who are obtaining confidential information from the participants also need to agree to protect the data, and they'll do that following local confidentiality rules as well as any applicable regulatory requirements. They need to ensure that the participant records that contain such information that's identifiable are not deliberately or accidentally disclosed. So that means they need to keep information in a locked cabinet. They need to make sure that they're not leaving information out that other people can find. And they should develop and follow procedures for release of the information only to authorized parties. Lastly, I'm going to go into safety reporting and adverse events. So throughout studies, we need to collect adverse events and serious adverse event information. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the difference here. So adverse events are defined as any physical or psychological occurrence in a human subject participating in research, whether or not considered related to treatment. So anything that happens to a participant during the study, any sort of side effect, needs to be captured as an adverse event. And it does not matter if you think it's related to the treatment or not. And this would be captured in a progress note and then reported on the case report form. Now, serious adverse events, again, are just more serious adverse events. And there's a definition for those, and they're defined as either a death or a life-threatening experience. So maybe somebody has like a anaphylactic reaction, a hospitalization, or prolongation of a hospitalization. So let's say they're already hospitalized for something and they have a heart attack while in the hospital, that would be a serious adverse event. If they have a significant disability or incapacity or birth defect, or any event that jeopardizes the participant and may require medical or surgical treatment to prevent, a hospitalization or a death or some sort of life-threatening experience. And all of these are reported usually on a progress note and then into an SAE report. And SAEs must be reported within 24 hours of the site learning of the serious adverse event to the sponsor. So lastly, I want to thank you for attending this session. We also have another session coming up next month on the protocol and informed consent, and we'll go into more detail about both of those documents. And if you'd like to follow VRG, you can go to our website here at vanguardresearch.com. We're also on LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook, and this presentation will be available on YouTube. So thank you for your time today.